and an author of numerous books and essays on art. And he's also, together with Nada and also Christine Khoury, who's coming up later today as well, a member of the Art Dubai Modern Committee. So thank you for all the work you've been doing with Art Dubai, and for everybody who hasn't seen that section of the fair yet, it's just over in Mina Salam.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Antonia and Shimon for the invite to participate. So today I want to share with you a remarkable story of an artist, actually, journey with a particular form that he has used for 50 years. Okay, the artist is Rashid Arain, and the form I'll discuss today is his development and use of a lattice and grid structure that he's been using since the later 60s. So Rashid was born in Karachi in 1935, and started and studied civil engineering as a career, but became very interested in art. His early Karachi paintings, this is one of them, show correspondences with his contemporaries working out a language of modernist abstraction. But in his case, they were distinguished by a sense of rhythm and movement. And in this one, you can see structure, right? Values that he continued to develop in his later work in other media. In '69, he also produced a Fluxus-like performance, which was kind of highly innovative in Karachi at the time, by burning 2 bicycle tires, leaving behind their 4 metal-thin armatures that became a kind of an undulating sculpture. So, he and fellow artists would discuss art in cafes and exhibitions and so on, but he generally felt stifled by the lack of opportunities in Karachi at the time and decided to move to England. And he arrived to England in 1964 and has resided there since. So after moving to England, he continued to work as a civil engineer and to continue to develop his artistic ideas, inspired initially particularly by the works of Anthony Caro. In the way, and especially drawn to the way Caro had used engineering materials, steel, girders, and so on. But Rashid Arain also instinctively realized that Caro's work retained a sense of centrality and hierarchy. And one of the things that distinguishes Rashid Arain's kind of both his activist career as well as his formal work is his really emphasis on a sense of movement, but also a sense of equality, right? And now, based on his own civil engineering training, he began to develop a series of lattice and truss structures in the mid-'60s, a conceptual approach to modularity, industrial fabrication, and phenomenology that corresponds really with the rise of minimalism that was happening in the United States at the same time. By 1966, he had also become aware of the values of movement and equality that were key elements in his work. And he says, and I quote, "It was in '66 that I suddenly became aware also of the structural relations, the relations between equal elements in a particular system." And these are sketches from this is from 1968, okay, from his notebooks that you see his working out of the grid structure. Arain was also deeply interested in seeing the work of art not as a finished object, but also as a collective process, and developed projects and proposals for creating modular structures that would be continually rearranged by participants. And I don't have slides of those to show you. But one of the things he's interested in is both form as it exists, but also form that can be mobilized in various kinds of processes. Okay. And the way I understand these is that they need to be situated in an era of decolonization that held the promise of a world no longer defined by hierarchies, and in broad accordance with the aims of youth and social movements, during the later '60s as well. However, by the early '70s, Arain was thoroughly politicized by what he felt was institutional racism of the British art establishment, and with the wider issues of race, class, and perpetuation of basically Western imperialist legacies. Many of his works at that time, such as his Paki Bastard performance. So this is a performance that he did with, and this is documentation of the performance. You can see the grid structure above him, okay, in the images from the performance. So the Paki Bastard performance, of course, Paki Bastard being a derogatory term against Pakistanis in Britain. Okay, that's the. This was performed at the invitation of the Filipino artist David Medela at the Artists for Democracy platform as a continuation of the Black Manifesto. Okay, and this traces the personal journey of Rashid Arain from the Karachi to the UK and his growing consciousness of his own predicament as exemplary of the larger struggle of minorities in the UK against racism. This is the time when he becomes really involved in as an activist. So he does performances like this. He also joins many groups. He joins the Black Panther Party. Okay, and this is a time when him and many other artists begin reading a number of important post-colonial texts like Frantz Fanon and Marx, and suddenly become politicized. It's quite a sudden moment in their politicization that happens in the early 70s. As a theorist and supporter of the Black arts movement in the UK during the 80s, Arain, along with others, has confronted institutional racism and Eurocentrism, and informed by the legacies of Marx and Fanon, he has written a number of manifestos, essays, and observations about his own practice, and the role of critical modernism in relation to questions of equality, really. He began publishing this magazine called Black Phoenix, okay, which was issued in 1978. Only 3 issues of this magazine came out, but in 1987, this forms the precursor to another important magazine that continues to come out called Third Text, which started in 1987 and which became a very important one of the most important platforms really for articulating a conception of modern and contemporary art, which is based on a variety of global perspectives. So in some ways, the Rashid Arain and other sort of artists associated with the Black art movements are really at the forefront of what we understand today as as global art, right? And the question of art being modern and contemporary art that we see as flourishing all over the world and not just in Eurocentric and European contexts. Now, after his extraordinary and decades-long, and again you see, this is again, the cover reproduces an image from the Paki Bastard performance, right, which was done a year earlier. Now, after his extraordinary decades-long commitment to the intellectual development and equality in the global art world for the larger cause of post-colonial art, Rashid Arain is now primarily focused on his own studio and artistic practice. So we can place his evolving relationship with minimalism on the one hand being part of this kind of constructivist modernism, right? On the other hand, there is also the relation that he has with process and with activism. And what's interesting about him is that this form is not just a form that is a formal. He sees that as a formal work of art, but also something that is very much enmeshed in what he understands to be, a process towards equality. And in some ways, the repetition of form and the use of the diagonal is also part of this aesthetic. Here, I'm just going to, the few minutes that I have, I'm just going to focus on the question of color. Okay, so now there's a dialectic of color playing out here. The one is we looked at Black Manifesto, Black Phoenix, and Black. The question of blackness in art, right, in the UK, and blackness really meant anyone who's not white, okay, in the 70s and 80s. Okay, on the other hand, I'm going to talk about the very vivid and bright use of color in some of his formal works. Okay, despite their structural trust-like formations, the bright chromatic palette in these works create a sense of levity and optimism. That might otherwise have been subdued if the color was confined only to industrial hues. The use of dematerialization, the sense of it, color, I would argue, also creates a sense of dematerialization to these otherwise quite, industrialized forms. Is also, evoked by Arain's innovative use of the diagonal as a stabilizing element. And you can see the diagonal, of course, in these. and which makes from an engineering point of view makes the structure lighter than it would be otherwise. If you didn't use the diagonal, you would just you'd need heavier elements to make the same structure. Okay. Beyond its formal significance, the diagonal also evokes an aesthetic passage beyond rigid conformity to the rectangular grid. This sense of the levity of constructive possibility and the potential for short-circuiting established norms are established by traversing the diagonal. These, I believe, are important evocations for mobilizing the imagination of artists and thinkers, especially those coming from post-colonial background. So Rashid's engagement with geometry has been sculptural, bodily, and phenomenological since the mid-60s, and already moved beyond the confines of two-dimensionality. Even the truss and lattice forms can be described in theory by rule-based formulations. Their experience in the gallery necessarily entails encountering them dynamically as one changes bodily location. And then you experience the shifts of perception, which become activated by focusing on how different planes in the structural elements interact with one another and project inward and outward based on their chromatic contrast and their dimensional placement. So, some of these works versions of these works you can also see in the contemporary section in the Icon Gallery fair. So he continues to work and produce these. So one cannot help, I think, but reflect on Arain's precocious use of his first mature artistic medium, constructivist sculpture, which not only imaginatively engaged his civil engineering training and his interest in modernism, but also confronted in some ways, one of the things he confronted was also a kind of a stereotypical and reductive notion of Islamic art, right, which has to do with geometry and so on, for its kind of, alleged two-dimensionality and stasis. So here again, we find ourselves at another juncture where Rashid Arain has been a trailblazing artist and thinker for us to continue to engage with. Thank you.